everybody, this is Sheritta Bitikofer with Emerging Civil War, and I'm here with Dr. Damian Shiels at Andersonville National Historic Park. Earlier today, he gave a presentation about his project with the Irish Americans at Andersonville. So I'd like to start off by letting Dr. Shiels go ahead and introduce himself, talk a little bit about your background, your career, how you got interested in the Civil War, and what got you interested specifically for Irish Americans in the Civil War.
Cool, no bother, Sheree. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I suppose my background is I'm an archaeologist, kind of semi-recovering. I still do a bit of archaeology, but archaeologist and historian. But yeah, from an American Civil War perspective, I suppose I started getting really deep dive interested in about 11 years ago. About 20 years ago, I'd worked on a major exhibition in our National Museum of Ireland, where one of the galleries was based on Irish in America. And when I was doing that, I really was astounded about the level of Irish service in the Civil War that I hadn't realised was quite as extensive as it was, even though I'd had a long-term interest in it. And after that, I set up this site, which is to say, it's been going for 11 years. And that kind of led on to a few things, like I did a couple of books on the Civil War, eventually went off and did a PhD on the Civil War. I think everybody's probably watching this, and everybody who's involved in the Emerging Civil War is well aware of what happens when you start looking at the Civil War and the rabbit holes you go down and how all-consuming it is of your life. So all of that then leads to where you're standing in Anderson, because we're talking about the people who died in Anderson. So that's kind of the background in a nutshell.
Cool. And talk a little bit about the Irish in America before the Civil War and kind of leading up to their participation in the war.
Yeah, no problem. So I suppose that the big kind of defining event of the mid-19th century from an Irish perspective is the Great Irish Famine, as it's called, from 1845 to 1852, which decimated the Irish population. It still hasn't recovered even today. And it saw huge numbers of immigration. 1 million people died, but mass immigration all through the late 1840s and 1850s. So there had been significant Irish immigration pre-famine into major urban centres in the United States, but this really kind of sets it off on a whole new level. And as a result, you have this huge flood of largely rural Irish people coming into America. But when they come here, they go to urban centres. So they're picking places, particularly New York City, but other places, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, all of these sort of locations are where they're going. And they're going there because they're largely unskilled and they're working in labouring positions and reliant on things like factories and that sort of work. And they're quite cohesive. They're not very welcome through a lot of the 1850s, and so they tend to stick together. They tend to intermarry intergenerationally, so they're kind of a quite recognisable group when they're living in these urban areas. And all of that means that by the time the American Civil War starts, there's 1.6 million Irish-born people living in the United States, and very relevantly for what we're talking about, of them, around about 1.5 million of them were living in states that would remain loyal to the Union. So as a result, there's an overwhelming majority. There's about 9 Irish Union soldiers for every 1 Confederate Irish soldier. So there's a mass differential because of this huge concentration of the Irish in the industrial cities of the north. And so that's kind of where things were when the Civil War kicks off.
Okay. And everybody knows about the famous Irish Brigade that was largely Irish. However, from your studies, you found that the Irish were really spread out throughout the entire army.
Yeah. I actually often, and I'm a big fan of the Irish Brigade and looking at the research, and they are the most important, even then they were the most important Irish unit. But I do feel they've become almost a bit like a black hole for people's perceptions of the Irish in the American Civil War. It's all about the Irish Brigade. If you stacked up all the books on the Irish in the Civil War, the Irish Brigade massively dominated. But the Irish actually didn't serve together in the same numbers as, say, the Germans did, with the famous 11 Corps concentrations and things like that. The Irish, there's 2 brigade level formations, the Irish Brigade, Corcoran's Legion. There's an awful lot of what I call ethnic green flag regiments, so regiments that form specifically to represent the Irish in their states, and they're spread out all over the northern states. But the vast majority of the Irish, the ones who often get left behind because they're usually harder to discover, they're harder to get at, are the Irish who serve in other volunteer units. Most Irish don't serve in these ethnic units, and huge numbers of them who serve in the Union Navy, so 1 in every 5 US sailors during the war born in Ireland. The regular army, there's more Irish-born men than American-born men at Fort Sumter in 1861, and the Irish consistently enlist in the regular army throughout the war because it's a traditional form of employment for them. And so a lot of these guys have kind of been left out of that conversation, and they have to be reincorporated if we want to get the full kind of range. And so the way I think people should visualize Irish service is to think about places like New York City and places like Philadelphia, and think about the urban units that are drawn from these states. And if you're thinking of an urban unit, it's almost always going to have a decent Irish representation or some Irish representation, and that's where most of these guys experience Civil War.
Okay. And you also talked in your earlier presentation about the kind of stigma or stereotype of 1863, 1864 conscripted soldiers, or not volunteer, but the
substitutes and bounty men.
Yeah.
And I think, and I've come back to it a couple of times because it's one of the things I'm increasingly interested in because I've been looking at the Irish in such detail. We have, and it's not everyone, and it's not clear black and white, if you like, but everybody in the Civil War is kind of lumped into this. They were early war volunteers who were patriots, or they were late war guys who were a bit dodgy, not very patriotic, and really were just mercenaries. A term, I must say I detest the term mercenary. But in any event, if you look at these guys, and if you look at the working class guys from urban areas, and I would go beyond the Irish, I think this is probably true of most urban working class poor, they're much more complicated than that kind of portrayal, that classic portrayal would suggest. And so you have guys who have been affected by the crisis that is caused by secession and have been thrown out. There's tens of thousands of workers losing their jobs in factories in Philadelphia and New York after the secession of South Carolina. There are guys who have an economic motivation, who are on the field at Bull Run. I know this is the case among the Irish. I would be amazed if it wasn't the case among working class from other areas. Equally, there are guys who enlist in 63, 64 for a substitute bounty, who are there because their main drive is patriotism. And of course, these aren't an either-or situation. In fact, I would say that the bulk of the Irish are there because it's a little bit of both, because there's an economic incentive for a lot of them to do this, particularly as the war progresses, but also, and this is something I think, again, that can sometimes, we don't appreciate quite so much how invested in the United States they are. They really are invested in the project of the United States and the Republic as an opportunity for them and their children to kind of get on. And so, yeah, we were chatting earlier on, and I was talking about, a guy I have who's living in Canada in late 1863. He crosses the border, he enlists for a lot of money as a substitute, and the first thing that guy does is he sends the money back across the Atlantic to get his mother out of a workhouse so she can come to America. And she never meets him because he's gone and he gets killed in the Overland Campaign. And I struggle to see that what he did there is any less than somebody who enlists in 1861 because of patriotic fervour. And I think we are a bit too strong on the early war guys. They're really interesting obviously, but there's such a focus of work on them that I'd like to see a bit more. And obviously there's some great scholarship on it, but I'd like to see a bit more really looking at these late war guys that weren't all bounty jumpers and weren't all mercenaries.
Absolutely. And kind of transitioning into your Irish at Andersonville project, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as we're chatting again, whenever I come to the States, I normally try and find a national cemetery at the earliest opportunity, and then spend a ridiculous amount of time walking up and down gravestones, Irish sound names, and then going into searches for them. It's absolutely one of the things that I enjoy the most, because it just brings you such a huge amount of information about people as a study group. But of all the national cemeteries, if you want to go to the place that has the most Irish from the Civil War who died in it, the 13,000 odd men who didn't survive Andersonville is the national cemetery that I think has the most. And so really that's where the project began. It was the idea that they would be a very important study group to try and look at who was there, first of all, identify them. Who are the Irish Americans buried at Andersonville? What units did they serve in? what relations do they have today who still look after them, where did they come from in Ireland. And so the kind of bones of the project is to make publicly available, and we have the first stages of it currently on the project website. But it's a database of the Irish Americans, and then for those who've been identified to a location in Ireland, which is approaching half of them, we've a little over 500 identified so far, but on the island of Ireland then to mark where they were from in Ireland when we can get that information. And so already we've identified men from each of the 32 counties on the island of Ireland. So that was a kind of starting point for it, and brilliantly the reason I'm here is because the Friends of Andersonville and the National Park Service are facilitating and through grant funding my research here for a few days. We've got funding as well from the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Irish Consulate General in Atlanta, and also we're getting assistance from Professor Nicholas Allen at the University of Georgia. So kind of coming together to explore them, to remember them, but also to use them as this group. So we can explore stories like how cohesive were they in Andersonville prison? How do they associate with each other when they were here? What impact did it have on their families when they didn't survive? What were their immigrant circumstances? What were their enlistment circumstances? Why were they coming in? You have a great mix at Andersonville of Irish veteran volunteers and these late war substitutes, bounty guys. You've lots of guys who deserted almost immediately when they came in, die here. And looking kind of at their backstories, I think gives you this kind of broader, more nuanced, more complex picture. And so that was the reason that we did it in a very long-winded response.
Well, that's very good. And from all of your research, you said that you found at least one person in all 32 counties.
Yeah.
And most of them might have been 1863, 1864.
Yeah, we're not
Soldiers.
sure on that, but there's definitely a good number who are late. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. There's quite a number of veteran volunteers too.
Okay.
Yeah.
But are there any other patterns that you've found in your research amongst those that you have been able to identify?
Yeah. So again, it's early days, and this is all subject to change depending on where we get. But so currently, we of the 500 plus that we've identified, there's interesting things in relation to, say, age. So about 55% of them are aged in their 30s or 40s when they die here, which is obviously significantly older than the average age of a union volunteer. And it doesn't take much research into Andersonville to see why that might have been the case, that obviously older men were more susceptible to what was happening here. They were less able to withstand how horrific it was to survive in Andersonville. We've got age ranges for them. So the two youngest men that we've got are both 16 years old, Irish Americans. The oldest man that we've identified so far is 54 years old. He had added, subtracted 10 years from his age in order to enlist, almost certainly for economic reasons, I would suggest, later in the war. We can tell from where they're from that we're getting the concentrations we might expect. So County Cork in the south of Ireland, the south coast of Ireland, had the largest population in and around the time of the famine. So County Cork tends to be the one that always has the most when it comes to service, and so far they have the most that we've identified in Andersonville. But in a broader perspective, Munster, which is the southern province of Ireland, has the most guys from there, mass emigration from there. And then along that western seaboard of Ireland, up to the northwest, places like Donegal, for example, have high numbers because there was a lot of emigration out there in the post-famine years as well. So we're able to identify a lot of that sort of stuff, and we're trying to take it a bit further then and look at the units that they were in. So, we were talking a few minutes ago about how the Irish didn't serve in just the Irish Brigade or just Corcoran's Legion. So far of the 500 plus guys, we have about 180 different United States units here. So in one group, it shows you that they're everywhere across the north. So.
And you mentioned a little earlier about the cohesion between the Irish prisoners that were at Andersonville and their relation to each other, and you talked a little bit about it in your presentation as well, and the Andersonville Raiders and that kind of thing. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so I think the Andersonville Raiders are a good obvious example of some Irish cohesion. So there was quite an Irish American flavour to a number of the Raiders, and obviously there's still discussion as to the degree to which they were one group or multiple groups. But the attack on the man that leads to really all action being taken against them was largely led by Irish Americans. So we can see in the raiders that there is some cohesion among Irish there, certainly. But I mean, that's, if you like, the darker side, the Irish cohesion here. There were plenty of Irish who weren't very keen on what the raiders were up to at all. But we see it in relation to who men are interacting with and who they're talking to. So some very interesting examples. There's a guy called Michael Doherty, who later received the Medal of Honor, but he's here, 13th Pennsylvania Cavalryman. And he, when he came out of Andersonville, is reported in the local press to have brought 2 wills back. And the wills that he brings back out of there, in total 4 men are named. And in them are 4 guys who are from County Donegal. So they're all from the same place in the northwest of Ireland. But also, they're all guys who enlist in separate units. They weren't all in the same unit, in Pennsylvania. So what's binding them seems to be Donegal and Pennsylvania. And we're seeing this quite a bit coming through when you look at things like the affidavits that men are giving for comrades who died here, so helping out widows and dependents. We're seeing guys who aren't necessarily in the same unit, but they tend to be Irish American. Not always, there's plenty of exceptions. They tend to be Irish American, they tend to be from the same Irish American community in the United States. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of interweaving ties between them. And again, there are exceptions. There are Irish guys who spend their time here tenting with guys from the brigade that they served in, who none of whom seem to be Irish American. But I think it's showing that more often than not there is this cohesion. And there has been work done, statistical work, that has shown that Irishmen who come in when other Irishmen from the same company are here have a higher statistical chance to survive Andersonville. So there's definitely an element of this Irish cohesiveness in their experience in here, much as we see in their actual experience when they're out serving on the front lines.
Right. And you've mentioned pension records and affidavits. Is that where the bulk of your research, where you're going to for all this information?
Yeah. Speaking of black holes, it was one I went down to a little over a decade ago, and I doubt I'd be going to my grave having never emerged from it. I just think they're the most wonderful source. So I spend most of my time on widows and dependent pension files. That's where I do the bulk of my research. A lot of them digitized thanks to the phenomenal work of the National Archives. But so you're seeing guys, so widows, you see, often can't prove that their husband or their son, if it's a mother, died here. And so they need to prove it if there's not something obvious that happens. And one way that they do it is they will get former comrades to go, yes, I shared a tent with him, or yes, I was there with him, or I buried him. And this is very, very common in these files. And then you can look at these guys and they say what unit they're from, what their name is, and you can then trace them. And so we're trying to do that, as well as just looking specifically at the guys buried. We're trying to trace these other guys. We're trying to look at diary references. A couple of diaries are written by Irish men. We're trying to look at newspapers, what other people think of the Irish. So trying to get as broad a picture as we can.
Okay. Hey everybody, we're back again. So as Chris Mikowski would say, we use the magic of technology to transport into our living rooms or our offices. We were having a little bit of technical difficulties at Andersonville, but so we weren't able to record the rest of the interview with Dr. Damian Shiels here. But at least now we don't have bugs and there's no horrendous wind we have to deal with. So we're just going to finish up the interview. This is a couple of weeks later, but we're still going to be talking about the Irish at Andersonville and more of Dr. Shiels' projects as well. So welcome back, Damian. Thank you again for this. You've been
great to be back. Cheers. Magically transported from the beautiful sunshine of Andersonville to the lashing rain of Cork and Ireland. So
it's been sunshiny
real
here.
World.
So, yeah.
I'm missing the American weather of the South in the winter already.
Nice. Yeah, it's definitely different. Okay, so one of the last question that I think got cut off somewhat in the middle is, what is your favorite story from the different soldiers that you've been researching of that were at Andersonville?
Yeah, so there's a guy that's very close to my heart, and I will say we're doing for time, but there's a new one as well that's kind of snuck in there. He's very high on the list as well. But the one, and I wrote about him in my last book, is a guy called Hugh Coyle. Hugh was in the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry. and he was captured just after Gettysburg during the Confederate retreat back out of Pennsylvania. There was an engagement at a place called Monterey Pass, and Hugh was one of a number of 8th Pennsylvania cavalrymen who were captured there. And Hugh, unsurprisingly, given the nature of the project that we're running on the Andersonville Irish, ultimately perishes at Andersonville and is buried there. But what interested me in particular about him, he's from a very rural part of Ireland, right up in the northwest of the country, in County Donegal. And Donegal has a particular immigration pattern into Pennsylvania as well. So you come across an awful lot of Donegal immigrants in Pennsylvania. And Hugh was the main support for his 2 elderly parents who had not left Ireland. So you see this quite a lot, where the children of people have gone to America and they're sending money back. So Hugh was consistently sending money back from Philadelphia to his elderly parents in this very, very rural, isolated, poor part of Ireland. And there's a pension file associated with Hugh. And it starts with his mother in the early 1870s walking from this rural couple of fields on the Fana Peninsula in County Donegal down to her local big town. And she is looking to contact the United States government in order to try and get a pension. And she talks about how herself and her husband are very aged, infirm, how they relied on their son Hugh, who was captured after Gettysburg and died in southern prisons, to help finance them. And she talks about how they are now in serious danger if the American government doesn't help them, because their landlord is looking to evict them to graze black cattle on their land. And normally when you read pension files, you have to be pretty cautious, because people, they, as I would say here, try and over-egg the pudding. They're really trying to put their worst foot forward to say, look, situation is dire, you have got to help me. So sometimes you have to think, oh, well, maybe she wasn't about to be evicted. But this is the wonderful thing about the American Civil War 19th century files. Very next page in the file that's in the National Archives in DC is the actual eviction notice that the landlord gave to them in Northwest Donegal. So these are immensely rare even in Ireland, but it's preserved because of what happened to Hugh Coyle at Andersonville. And it's a big formal document telling the family that they are about to be evicted. And of course, anyone who knows about Irish nationalism and the Irish kind of situation in the 19th century knows that landlordism and issues with landlords and everything is one of the reasons why a lot of people went to America in the first place. And it plainly states that they're going to be put out of the land. So Hugh's death at Andersonville allows them to access finances from the American government that helps them to, if you like, survive this event. We don't know what happened to them. They presumably were evicted, but we do know what happened to the landlord. The landlord was like called the Third Earl of Leitrim, and he was a notorious landlord. And a few years after this event, people went over in a rowboat from the Fana Peninsula, where Hugh Coyle was from, and they bashed his head in and killed him, his tenants, and then subsequently fled to America themselves. He was that hated. But it was quite a connection for me, because I stood in the fields where Hugh Coyle grew up, where that family were from, and now stood at his grave in Andersonville. And that link across, like, such an incredible distance is quite remarkable. I would point to another guy as well that I think is worth mentioning, because it did just come up about a month ago. Just before I went over to Andersonville, the last talk I gave was in West County Clare, another area that was badly hit by the famine in Ireland. And I was doing a bit of work on some of the Andersonville guys from Clare as a result of that. And I was looking at one of the guys, another guy whose grave I stood at when I was in Andersonville, a guy called Owen Maloney, who went into a New Jersey regiment. And what's remarkable about Owen's story is that we know, based on the files associated with him, that Owen actually was a famine survivor on the hard end of the famine. Irish immigrants to the United States very rarely ever mentioned the famine. It was a source of embarrassment and shame for a lot of them. I've come across maybe 3 or 4 references ever to it in relation to American Civil War pensioners. But Owen's file talks about the death of his father. During the Irish famine, people who were destitute, who were off the land, often had to rely on these public work schemes. So they would be told, okay, if you go and build this road in this area here, we will give you relief. And so his father was doing that, and his father, obviously in a weakened state because of famine, dies on that scheme. Owen Maloney, who's about 13 at the time, takes his place on that scheme to build this road in West Clare to try and support his destitute mother and siblings. He eventually gets work as a servant, saves up the money to go to the United States, ends up in the army, enlists, and then dies in Andersonville prison of the same type of diseases that his father would have perished of in the Great Famine. And it gives us that direct link. And I think it's particularly poignant with the Irish in Andersonville that there are guys in there who would have seen people dying of the same diseases, often having direct familial experience of it, of what's happening to them at Andersonville. And it kind of adds a whole level of poignancy to it when you think about it, like, you know, surviving that only to perish in similar circumstances with similar diseases. So currently Hugh and Owen would be the kind of two standout, I think, stories, individual stories that
And something you kind of touched on in Hugh's story about being able to stand in the field where all that action was taking place, because you're in a really unique position where you can be studying about these guys that immigrated to America, but then be able to go to the exact farm or house or, you know, location where they came from or where their family still was.
Yeah, no, and that is particularly that's particularly special. Like it can be quite rare to identify individual buildings sometimes, particularly because a lot of these Irish guys, of course, are only recorded as being from Ireland generally. But often when they've died in places like Andersonville, there can be a bit more information. And it is really special particularly when you can go to both places, because you know you're probably the first person to have done that since the individual. The American Civil War isn't something that's studied very intensively in Ireland, unfortunately, even though like it's the only conflict that compares with the First World War in terms of the numbers of Irish people who served in it. But you can be pretty confident, really, that there's very few of these ordinary guys whose family have ever looked at the areas that they're from here before they go to the States. A particularly special one that was important to me, and I haven't been to the site yet, but it's another individual. He served in the 16th Connecticut Infantry and dies at Andersonville. And actually, based on the information that I've got, there's a ruined house on the corner of a mountain up in what's now Northern Ireland, and we know that that's the house that he was born in. A guy called Robert Ballantyne. He's buried there, and like you can go in and you can go on to Bing Maps I use because it has a bit better resolution than Google Maps on this, but not a party political broadcast on behalf of Bing. But in any event, you can go right down to the ruined farmhouse that he originates out of. And so it does kind of add, you know, you particularly being in Ireland, there's a lot of disadvantages if you study the American Civil War from being in Ireland, because obviously I'm a long way from the archives in Andersonville and places like that. So it has a lot of challenges, but it does give you a perspective and an access to stuff that can be difficult if you're studying a lot of immigrant history from, say, the United States looking back. So I can see from where they're coming from, and gives you that kind of, you know, connection, I think. And as we were talking about there's nothing like standing in a place, is there? There's nothing like handling something that was there. There's nothing like standing in a place where something's happened. And for me, there's nothing like being somewhere where people left from and thinking about the journeys that they're taking in the 19th century. And also the connections that they're maintaining back and forth across. It's quite remarkable to think of. Like, I'm thinking to the journey it took me to get to Andersonville there now, which, you know, obviously with the wonders of modern flight, etc., but it was still, you know, I was pretty exhausted, and it's not an easy journey. These people are going huge distances to a climate that is just so alien to them. That was a big experience for me at Andersonville as well. Thinking about places like the Fana Peninsula, where Hugh Coyle is from, the rain that I'm looking outside the window now that we'd be used to. And then, you know, you're running around with like rattlesnake warnings and everything fired up. Like, we just don't have that problem here. But the heat, the weather, all of that sort of stuff, you know, that feeds into everything about the experiences that these people are having. So yeah, it's highly recommended. We should start doing tours in Ireland and Germany and places in Europe, going around visiting where all these guys were from originally before they go off.
Yeah, and when you start having those tours, I'm booking my flight because someplace
Yeah,
I've always wanted to go.
yeah. More than welcome anytime.
Awesome. And talking about being on the ground at Andersonville, now that we can kind of talk about this post visit,
Yeah.
you did some research at Andersonville for your project. How was that experience in doing the research in the archives there?
Yeah, super. Well, like, I mean, I was saying this at the time. I'm always in awe of the National Park Service anyway. Every time I go to the US, I'm just in awe of it. I'm in awe of the entire organization, the way they set up, how helpful they are, the actual sites themselves. It's just phenomenal. And I don't think, particularly in Ireland, we don't really have that. It just blown away every time I do it. So the guys at the site were incredibly helpful. I did two things when I was there. I suppose one of the things was I actually walked all of the almost 13,000 headstones to try and identify people and take photos of Irish people. But they have a phenomenal little archive in Andersonville as well, which I was working on. And they have files on different things like the Andersonville Raiders and, say people from the state of Connecticut at Andersonville. Great database of information. But one of the really, I was particularly interested in is they have a whole series of files that they've maintained over the years on individuals who were either kept at Andersonville or died there. So people who survived as well. And what a lot of this information seems to be is people, families who are descended from people who are in Andersonville are sending in things. So there's like copies of photos, copies of letters, copies of diaries, an absolutely phenomenal resource. And so as part of that, I came across an awful lot of Irish guys. One of the best ones that I came across was a whole series of letters, photographs at three different stages of his life of this man called Roger Brown, who emigrated. He was a widower. There's a great photo of him and his young son. He ends up in an Illinois regiment. He's captured at Kennesaw Mountain. All these letters pouring out of the place. And I'm looking at these going, oh, wow, these are amazing. I spend a lot of my time doing work on Irish letter writers, so I have a soft spot for correspondence. And eventually it says where this guy is from. And he's actually from the same places where I'm from, in very rural West Limerick, where I've only ever come across, I think, 2 or 3 people who've ever been in the Civil War. And so this phenomenal stack of letters, and this guy is from the same place as me. And it's difficult not to think, that it's a bit of serendipity about that. But so there's going to be great context to a lot of it. So that's produced out of it. Original diary copies of people like Michael Doherty from Falcarra, who in Donegal, and their Donegal guy, Medal of Honor recipient from the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry, who had a lot of guys in Andersonville. So copies of his original diary are in there that was subsequently published. But that type of information is gold dust for the kind of context that we're trying to set for the Irish experience about how these guys are interacting, the degree to which their Irish ethnicity, their class and everything is impacting their experiences there. So now, as well as just the guys who perished there, we're the work in the archives is kind of giving us more of that sort of contextualization, I suppose.
Fantastic. Yeah. And for anybody who wants to kind of tap into all of this research, you're publishing all of this on your website. How do they navigate onto the website in order to see all this information? What's the best way to kind of configure that?
Yeah, so the website, it's all sitting on IrishAmericanCivilWar.com, and up the top you'll see the Andersonville Irish Project. So it's got its own kind of static page there where we're updating this geographic map of Ireland. So any guy that we're locating to county or below level, we're pinning them on Ireland. And we have all 32 counties marked up now. And there's an ongoing database of guys that we have, of guys who have been confirmed as Irish American as well, that's been uploaded onto that. And that's going to be kind of jazzed up a bit over the coming months or year or so. But it's all sitting there, and we're doing regular posts as well on Andersonville Irish. So people can come on there, and very encouraging of people if they have information about someone, whether it's their own journey of how they found out about an Irish American ancestor at Andersonville or anything, to get in touch with us, because we're trying to collate all that information together. So we have a project email that's on the page, but it's andersonvilleirish@gmail.com. And very keen to hear from anybody who has anything to kind of contribute in terms of identifying people or photographs, images, letters, or just general information. And I suppose other than that, to kind of stay tuned to it, to see like the type of material, because we have reams of material that we have to like get up there now. That's the next challenge. We have so much information to be putting up there. So it's going to be a consistent kind of new elements that'll be emerging every few weeks on the site.
Awesome. So yeah, if you definitely have information about Irish at Andersonville, photos and anything, send them on to Damian.
Definitely. Love to get them.
Awesome. And also kind of on that same vein, talking about the website and contributions, is you had sent out, because I've subscribed to the blog, you sent out an email.
One of the people who helps keep it going.
Yeah. You had sent out an email, I guess it was a few months ago now, that you're opening to guest posts. So any other scholars or historians that want to publish blogs about or articles about, and not just Andersonville or the Irish at Andersonville, but also Irish in general.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, we've done a revamp of the organization of the site now. So I've been joined by Dr. Catherine Bateson and by Brendan Hamilton. So we're all editing it together. And one of the things that we're hoping to kind of increase is that people can tell their stories, and we can put them up. So there's a set, if you go onto the IrishAmericanCivilWar.com page, up on the top again, you'll see submission guidelines. And if you click into that, you get all the information about if you'd like to submit something in relation to the Irish, if you have a proposal, kind of similar, I think, to the way you run things in Emerging Civil War. If there's something that relates to the Irish that you want to share, and kind of our standards on how we do that, and how to contact us and get in touch with that. So we're really keen to hear from anyone. And it's not just, we want to hear from young historians, academic historians, people who are just interested, people who have family connections, the whole range. So anybody who has anything that they'd like to share.
Awesome. And this is kind of a twofold question. You published a few books about the Irish Americans in America and in the Civil War. Can you tell us a little bit about those books? And do you have any intentions on publishing a book once you've gotten a good bit of your research done about the Irish at Andersonville, publishing a book specifically on that topic too?
Good questions, right? So the first one is, so there's two books I have on the, both published with the History Press on the Civil War. They both kind of grew out of the website, actually. But so the first one is called The Irish and the American Civil War, nice and simple. And that's kind of a series of different, I suppose, effectively stories that kind of look from the start of the war through to the end and into the aftermath. So things like Fort Sumter, things like the Irish associations with the hunt for Lincoln's assassins are all in there. The second one is based on, I've spent most of the last decade looking at thousands upon thousands of widows' pension files relating to Irish people. That's my main area of research. So the second book, which is called The Forgotten Irish Immigrant Experiences in America, is a series of chapters that are dedicated to an individual family that explores really particular. So Hugh Coyle, that we were talking about earlier, is one of those chapters, and it looks about really how the American Civil War created the greatest bank of information on ordinary Irish people that exists anywhere in the world, including Ireland, from the 19th century, because of these pension files, because of the information these people are giving out. And it's one of the only places that we can actually reach those stories and hear them speak. And particularly a lot of women, for example, who are often very silent from this period if they were working class Irish immigrants. So that's the second book, looks at that. So it kind of covers, and there's a couple of Andersonville guys in that book as well. In terms of the Andersonville Irish, yes, it's primarily a digital project. I'm increasingly thinking that as well as being a digital project, I mean, there is definitely it's publications on it. And I would like to think that we might get a book together on it. It'll be a matter of kind of when we decide, okay, this is as many of the guys as we can identify. The amount of information that is poured out of even the project so far, and we have hundreds of guys identified so far. There are letters everywhere, images everywhere. So many guys identified, so many different aspects of the Irish experience coming out that it just does seem like it deserves a book. I do probably prior to that have to publish the book out of my doctoral work, which is on Irish letters, Irish correspondence as well. So hopefully there'll be a couple in the pipeline over the next few years. But definitely the Andersonville Irish one, I think, will be hopefully a nice one to get out. Just dealing with this group of Irish people almost as a kind of a study group to look at them. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, I'd be looking forward to that book whenever it comes out. And one question that we sometimes ask the interviewees and anybody who's published a book is, what is one question that you have not received from viewers or readers or basically anybody else? What question have you not received that you wish you had the chance to answer? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it would differ between Irish and American audiences, probably. Yeah, it's one to think about. Definitely in an Irish context, I don't hear enough about what the American Civil War can tell us about the study of Irish women in the 19th century. That's something that I just think it's an absolute goldmine for looking at ordinary women. So from an Irish context, I would talk about that. I think actually maybe in an American context, and I think it's a wider thing about the Irish experience in the Civil War, is we have this absolute razor focus on ethnicity. So, and this is something that crosses academic publications right through to the way we kind of perceive of things like the Irish Brigade. It's always ethnicity, ethnicity, ethnicity. It defines everything about the Irish. What I would like to hear more, and what I think needs to be discussed more, is class. We very rarely discuss the Irish, both as a major representative part of the urban working class. You know, these are the poor, white, urban people I'm talking here in the Northern military that are making up the bulk of armies like the Army of the Potomac. The poorer levels of society, and what, say, the Irish can teach us beyond ethnicity about class in America. And also the importance, we need to accentuate more the importance of class in how these people are treated. We kind of have this, it's everybody's anti-Irish, they're anti-Irish, they're anti-Catholic, and how guys are treated in the war. Their class is as important, maybe even more important than any of that when it comes to their experiences. So yeah, I think slightly different in the two places, but definitely more about women and what the Civil War records can tell us, and more about class and these people as really interesting representatives of working class white urban America.
Wow, awesome. And yeah, that's definitely something to be looking into and be thinking about. Kind of to wrap up, how can viewers or fans of your blog, how else can they get involved with the project or with your blog in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, sharing anything. The blog relies heavily on people like yourself who support it through things like Patreon, help with some of the back end running of the site, because it's grown absolutely gigantic over the last decade or so. But just to keep that type of stuff running. But really, it's all about engagement. You know, we're always interested in hearing about stories. I'm increasingly interested, and it's something that we hope to develop over the next while, in people's kind of personal family history of researching people, you know, people that they've discovered over time. And some interesting stuff has come out of the Andersonville Irish Project about kind of multi-generational research into an Andersonville victim, if you like, that, you know, that began with a great grandfather who started talking to people who had served with this Irish soldier all the way through, and how each generation kind of picked up the baton. I'm getting increasingly interested in how people's memory. So some of us may have only discovered an American Civil War ancestor 2 or 3 years ago. Other people have known about it for 60, 70, 80 years. Both are really interesting stories. They're both things I want to bring out in the Andersonville Irish Project. So anybody who has those type of stories, really interested. And you know, things like photographs of anybody who has any photographs of ordinary Irish people who serve in the war, or artifacts related to them, or anything like that in their families, we're always interested in hearing about them, because they make very interesting posts, and they're just terribly interesting. So really, you know, we're just interested in hearing from people. I should warn everyone, of course, that we get a lot of emails too, so it can take us a while to get back. But yeah, you can follow along. We have a Facebook page, Irish in the American Civil War. We're all on Twitter. All three of us are on Twitter. I'm Irish ACW. Brendan is at Revolted States, and Catherine is at Cat Bateson, so you can follow us all on Twitter. But yeah, just we're always trying to build a community.
Awesome. And that's what we're about at Emerging Civil War too, is building that community. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you, Dr. Damian Shiels, again, for being so patient about the technological issues and being willing to do these interviews and everything. Because we also did another interview for a roundtable that same day at Andersonville. So thank you for being a trooper and doing so many interviews.
It's a pleasure, Sheritta. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this. If you have any questions on YouTube or maybe to Dr. Shiels, forward those questions to them. And in the meantime, as Chris Mikowski says, we will see you online and on the battlefield. Thanks again.